From In the Beginning to the Musical Apocalypse, this is The Bible Says What. I'm your host, Mike Wiseman. When I was a kid, I was obsessed with dinosaurs. This was way before the Jurassic Park movies came out. When I was in 4th grade, I remember imagining I lived in a dinosaur world full of friendly, helpful dinosaurs, just like the ones on my favorite TV show, Dino Riders. But no matter how hard I tried, these dino friends of mine would not manifest themselves or interact in the real world. This is exactly how I see Yahweh. He refuses to interact with the real world in a way that would be convincing to the masses. Take the movie Poltergeist, for example. The chairs in the kitchen carried children across the floor. A portal opened up in the kid's closet and on the roof in the middle of the living room. A tree grabs a kid out of his bed. Actual ghosts come down the stairs. All of these things showed evidence of some other force present in the house. Until I see some sort of physical testable evidence, I'm going to have a very difficult time believing any of this magical man in the sky nonsense. In the Old Testament, Yahweh interacted with his people. He gave them special blood magic rituals explaining how to get them to come down and feast off sacrificed animals off his bronzed grill, Leviticus 9. He walked with Adam and Eve in the garden, and he had face-to-face conversations with Moses, Exodus 33:11. And now nothing. Why has he chosen to be so reclusive? Why is he hiding? Why does he refuse to move a chair across the kitchen floor, or a glass of water across the counter, or levitate a bed? Yahweh refuses to reveal himself in any tangible physical way. I've said it 100 times. If Yahweh wants to have a personal relationship with me that bad, he can come down and tell me himself. Why does he need Christians to spread his message? Let's start the show.
Is there anything in the Bible that you yourself have an issue with?
A divine blast. But
I actually enjoyed arguing with you and stuff.
God doesn't kill children.
What do you think the Passover was? Are you reading a different Bible?
No.
You worship him because of the things he's done. Why can I not judge him because of the things he's done?
Obey me or I'll kill your kids. It doesn't seem very
Well, that's brutal, isn't it?
Yeah.
Oh, man, what a tough life.
Today's special guest is the author of Faith After Doubt, Brian McLaren. Welcome to the show.
Thanks. Great to be with you, Michael.
Appreciate you coming on and sending me the book. That's awesome. I always love getting books from the guests. It's really fun. To be honest with you, though, man, I was a little disappointed. There was no autograph or to Mike in there.
Well, we'll have to try to remedy that somehow.
Awesome, good. I like those special notes that they send me. Those are fun. So tell us a little bit about your book.
Well, I was a pastor for 24 years, and
24?
in my life as a pastor, I had so many folks come to me over the years with their questions and doubts and things that just didn't make sense. Mm-hmm. And sometimes their questions really sort of ignited my own questions. And so I've always been interested about the intersection of faith and doubt, especially I grew up in a super conservative religious background where it wasn't really, asking questions and acknowledging doubt weren't really allowed. Right. So I left the pastorate some years ago, and but I still speak primarily to pastors. And I would say that hardly a week goes by where I don't hear from several people who tell me their faith is falling apart, or they're having serious doubts about this or that element of it. And it's surprising how many clergy are also in that situation. So all that came together to say this is something I've been struggling with for a long time, and maybe something I could help others with.
Interesting. So do you think it's a good thing to doubt?
Well, let's put it this way. It's a bad thing to just believe something because somebody else told you you have to, or somebody threatened you with some punishment if you didn't say that you believed it. So honesty is important, and that makes doubt important. Doubt in and of itself won't get us to where we need to go, but faith without any doubt I think is pretty dangerous. Among other things, it sets us up to be exploited. It sets us up to be ripped off by con artists, because that's how con artists work. They tell us to believe what they say, and put us in a position where we end up being manipulated by our naive faith.
Yeah, scary stuff. A lot of cult leaders out there. Like, get you in, and you just go follow the group, whatever the group does. Here, drink this Kool-Aid; it'll be great.
That's right.
Let's not do that.
And what's a little scary is those kinds of con artists exist in the world of religion, and in the world of business, and in the world of politics.
Everywhere.
And unfortunately, religious communities can easily become aggregators for people who want to believe, and then they become aggregators for people who can be manipulated. So that's why I think it's especially important to help Christians and people of other religions as well. But for me as a Christian, to especially help Christians, and especially I have a soft spot in my heart for pastors, since I was one for so long, to help pastors do a better job of helping people be honest with their questions and doubts.
Interesting. I kind of want to go back to something you said there for a minute. You said punishment if they don't say that they believe it.
Yes.
So do you find that if you don't believe something, a punishment for not believing that is wrong or shouldn't be done?
Maybe I can explain it like this. One of the things one of the insights really that became clear for me as I worked on the book is how faith isn't just an individual experience, and doubt is not just an individual experience, but because we belong to communities that are often bound together by agreements to certain creeds or doctrinal statements or beliefs, that our social life is really wrapped up with our doubts as well. And so what we end up experiencing, a lot of us experience, is that we're part of a group and we just raise an honest, sincere question. And then people realize this is a question that our group is not allowed to ask. And so the punishment might be, you won't be allowed to be a small group leader anymore because we don't trust you anymore because you admitted that you had this question. Now, interestingly, probably a lot of other people had that question too, but they just hadn't admitted it. Or it could even go farther, where people have to face the possibility of excommunication. And there's not just the theological dimension of that, but that often means separation from family and friends. At the beginning of the book, I tell the story of a young man who came to see me. He was a pastor. He dared to question what most of us would consider an extremely esoteric doctrine of his little church. And he was kicked out. And among the people who kicked him out were his parents and his one grandparent. So you can imagine how devastating that is.
Yeah, I mean, there's stories all over of people, not going with a certain religion and being excommunicated, no family interaction. I mean, just kick them to the curb and good luck. It's terrible. It's really, it's really terrible. But do you believe that punishing somebody for that non-belief is a just and fair thing to do?
Well, what would you mean by punishing?
Anything, regardless of what the punishment it is, any kind of punishment. Let's go with excommunication. Do you think that something something like that would be fair and just? I mean, even though they're just not believing or doubting. We can even go to Yahweh himself. Let's go with that. If you don't believe, you're going to go to hell. That's the kind of punishment we get with that non-belief or that questioning or doubting. Yeah,
that's right. And to me, this creates a whole system of fear where we're afraid to be honest with people, and then maybe we're even afraid to be honest with God. And a little distinction that has been helpful for me is to make a distinction between what we might call good faith in what we might call bad faith. Good faith being, I sincerely, honestly believe this, and I hold it, in my heart. But I think there's a danger of bad faith, which is, I say I believe this because I'll get in trouble if I don't.
Yeah.
And what's so ironic about that is that kind of bad faith in the name of avoiding punishment, it seems to me makes us into insincere, hypocritical, dishonest people.
Yeah.
And that's why I think there are really problems with the idea that you get punished for being honest. Now, for people who are deeply rooted in the Bible, they might be aware that unbelief is a very serious thing in the Bible, but unbelief is different than doubt or asking questions.
True.
Unbelief is when I say, I don't care what the evidence is. I don't want to see it that way, and I won't. And there's an awful lot of that out there.
True. But I mean, the Bible does talk about being a lukewarm Christian, and I kind of associate that with a Christian who's doubting the truth of things, who's doubting their faith or losing their faith. And what I see is Yahweh. It's a Revelation 3:15 where He's going to spit you out if you are lukewarm. He doesn't want you hot. He wants you hot. He wants you, full Yahweh, full devotion. And I see the questioning and the doubting as something He doesn't like. Is there a verse in particular that you can point to that says it's okay to doubt? That Yahweh's okay with doubt?
Well, first of all, I'd say I think it's really dangerous for me to prove a point by quoting one verse or for you. But in the interest of, since you asked, well, a good example would be in Psalm 51, where David confesses his sin. And he says, what you desire. He says, you don't just want sacrifices and burnt offerings. Really interesting he says that, because there are a lot of other verses in the Bible that says God does want sacrifices and burnt offerings.
Lots.
But he says, you don't want sacrifice and burnt offerings. What you desire is truth in the innermost being. And what he realized in another psalm that's attributed to David relating to the Bathsheba incident, in another psalm, in Psalm 32, he says, I kept silent about my sin, and my strength burned away like fever heat in summer. And so he's saying, I knew that I had done wrong, but I kept it secret. And so I think this idea of truth in the innermost being is really a big deal. And and what we end up with, if we don't acknowledge that belief should be free and unforced, because look, if you go to court and you make a testimony that's a false testimony because you've been paid to not say that, or you've been threatened with punishment, that's called testimony under duress. And it's not free and it's not honest. And I can't imagine God wanting us to make false confessions under duress. Does that make sense?
No, I totally understand. I don't see it as, I can see the same thing. If Yahweh is up there and really asking for us to believe, I don't think that the best way for Him to do it would be to threaten us with hell if we don't believe. I think that is the under duress part. I think it's very clear that the Bible says if you don't believe, if you don't follow this, if you don't have the faith, if you don't have the love for Yahweh or Jesus, then you're going to receive a punishment. And that punishment is an eternal damnation. And whether no matter how you interpret it, there's a lot of different ways. But what I see it as is a fiery pit. What I was told as a kid was my skin was going to be burnt off every day and then regrown just so we can do it all over again for eternity. This is what I was told hell was. This is the place for non-believers. And I see that 100%. I love that you said the testimony under duress. That's exactly how I see it.
Yeah, that's right. And I was brought up in a similar background, and I came to really question that interpretation and that understanding for a whole variety of reasons. But But I think if we focus on the positive side of this, what I think we'd say, if God is a wise and good, being, then of course, then God wouldn't want our eternal destiny to be dependent on our being dishonest. And what's interesting to me about that in the Bible, if you take, for example, one of the places where the Apostle Paul writes in most detail about faith is in Romans chapter 4. One of my favorite chapters in the Bible. And what's interesting about Abraham is that Abraham is held up as a hero of faith, yet Abraham had almost no beliefs. In other words, his faith was not so much a matter of a list of beliefs that he had to hold. For example, it's certain that he didn't believe in hell. The idea of hell never even emerges in the Old Testament.
Interesting how that happens.
So whatever Abraham's faith was that was commended in the New Testament, it wasn't just that he held the right list of beliefs. It's that he received the call to go out into the unknown and was willing to go because he trusted the integrity of the voice that was calling him. And
now, I'm gonna
that,
stop
to
you.
me, there's something.
I'm gonna stop you right there, though. Abraham, very interesting story. You can talk about him being called to do his thing and leave and start the whole whatever, but with the Isaac story, where Abraham took the orders from his God to go and kill his son as a sacrifice to his God. Now, at this point, did Yahweh know the thoughts of Abraham? Did Yahweh know his level of faith, his level of belief?
Yeah, that is one of the most problematic stories, isn't it? It's children are often told this story. It is a chilling story, and I think it's a highly problematic story. And the explanations I was given as a child in growing up in a fundamentalist church, I look back on it and I just think, that's unconscionable. If you were interested, I'd be happy to tell you how I understand that. You might disagree, but I'll tell you how I'd be happy to tell you how I understand it at this point.
Yeah, I'd love to hear your interpretation of it.
I think what we see in the book of Genesis is the only way people could tell history in those ancient times. They didn't have research and peer-reviewed articles, and they didn't have ways of verifying things, and so the way they told history was through stories. And what we see in the very beginning of Genesis, when you look at the whole book as a whole, is we see a fratricide. We see Cain killing Abel over a matter of sacrifice, actually. And so I think the book of Genesis is a book that's really about violence. And then we see the story of the flood, where God decides to kill everybody, which I think has all kinds of interesting moral and ethical problems to it. Not only all people, but all animals and everything else. So I think the meaning of these stories is a lot more sophisticated than just talking about facts. But I think what happens when we get to the Abraham story is, I think that reflects the belief of ancient people. Listen, God doesn't want us killing people anymore. God doesn't want us killing people in God's name anymore. We can kill animals instead. And I think it reflects that advance in ancient human growth and understanding. And then we go even farther in the Old Testament. We come to like that psalm that says, God doesn't really care about animal sacrifices either. All God wants is integrity. Or we come to Malachi, where it says, God doesn't want sacrifices. God wants you to do justice, love kindness, and walk humbly with God. So that's why, for me, it would be impossible to talk about that Abraham story without seeing how it fits in with these other stories in the scriptures.
No, I love that. That's a great interpretation. I love it. But you went to Malachi, and in Malachi, it talks about the sacrifices and how they've never been good enough for him because they've been defective. Yahweh can't accept anything with a defect on it, which is, I guess, why he sent down his son, who is perfect, undefective, and used that blood to forgive everybody. Hebrews 9:22, without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness. So Yahweh needed this blood to forgive everybody, and he couldn't use the goats or defective. Anyways, regardless, I really want to go back to what you believe. First off, do you believe in a hell?
Well, I'm not really sure why you'd be asking me that, since we're going to be talking about faith and doubt.
Well, I mean,
are you asking me because
the repercussions
you want to decide
of doubt.
if you think I'm
Is
because
hell.
you think a person goes to hell? Yeah, I do not believe that.
Right.
Not at all. I grew up believing that, but I think that belief has so many harmful consequences.
Absolutely.
And I think there's a way of reading the biblical text that would make you say no. That makes me say that's not what I think is going on at all.
Yeah, well, the word fire, eternal fire and stuff, that kind of helps put that idea of hellfire in there. But, okay, so I just want to get a sense of what you believe, because I'm having a hard time pinning you down here. So what is the Bible to you?
Well, I'm interested why those things are of interest to you.
Because I want to know what you believe and why you believe, 100%.
But I'm interested in why. I'm interested in why. I'm sincerely interested. Is it because you're afraid that if I don't believe certain things, you shouldn't be talking to me?
No, not at all. I just want to know what you believe and why you believe, so we can have that conversation. You're telling me that the Old Testament has some things in there that you have an issue with, like the flood story, the Abraham story. There's some issues there. So I kind of want to, I don't want to pin down, but like figure out what it is exactly you believe, so we can continue and I can ask the right questions.
Okay. Well, I mean, I feel a little bit like I'm being asked to take a test. And to try to find out if
Sorry, I don't mean to. I don't mean it for it to be that way.
But no, it's great, because so many people feel that way, and this is exactly why I wrote this book. Because I think when we put people in a situation where they're tested based on their beliefs, I just think it's extremely common, and I think it's creating real problems.
Well, I think it better helps me understand you and where you're coming from. And if I don't ask these questions, if I don't find out what you believe, then I don't know where you're coming from. I don't understand your point of view, and I'd like to understand your point of view about all this.
Yes.
So regardless.
So I'll be happy to. Yeah. I mean, do you want to ask me a question about my point of view? So I grew up in a fundamentalist home that believed that the Bible must be interpreted literally, like you would interpret a scientific textbook or a phone book or something like that. That it was primarily a repository of information.
Same here. Same here.
And I don't believe that's what the Bible is.
Okay.
But and some people, when they're given only a choice, either you accept the Bible as that kind of, divine information, inerrant information, that sort of thing. Yeah. What they do is they say, well, that's not true, so they throw it away. I have not thrown it away. What I have done is I say, no, I think these are stories, and the important thing about these stories, I have no way of knowing for sure if they happen or not. I can look at evidence and so on, but people told these stories for a purpose. They told these stories seeking meaning. And so what I really want to do is I want to focus on the meaning, and I want to help other people learn to focus on meaning too. Because you know what, you and I could disagree on whether you take the Noah story literally or not, but we still can have a great conversation about its meaning. And we can have a great conversation about, for example, how does the meaning of that story, what would that tell us God is like?
Well, do you do this with other holy books or just the Bible?
I would do it with, I think anyone who takes any text seriously wants to interpret it correctly. And part of interpreting it correctly, I won't even use the word correctly. Let me use the word wisely, interpret it wisely. If you want to interpret something wisely, you have to be able to think about it and talk about it and listen to diverse viewpoints and not make an assumption before you start thinking.
Absolutely. So let's go to the flood story. How would you interpret that story?
Well, one of the really interesting things about the flood story is that we know there is a antecedent for that story in ancient Babylonian literature. You've maybe heard of the Epic of Gilgamesh. And in the Epic of Gilgamesh, it's really interesting to look at the way that the Hebrew people took that Gilgamesh story and changed it. And so in the Gilgamesh story, the gods are all up in heaven or wherever they hang out. And what they're really mad about is that people are staying up too late and making too much noise and keeping them awake. And so they decide to kill all human beings. Well, when you read the Genesis story, it's not a bunch of irascible, ill-tempered gods who didn't get a good night's rest.
Still ill-tempered, though.
God really cares about violence, and God is upset about the violence that's done. What's ironic when I read that story.
Hold on? Sorry, before you go, the violence part. What verse says anything about violence? It just says that everything they were thoughts or whatever was evil or wicked. I didn't see anything about violence. Did I miss that part?
Yeah, let me just. I'm sorry. Let me pull.
No,
my Bible
I love this part.
Here.
The Bible study part of the show is my favorite part. Just so you know. Yeah, love it. Because what I read is that God regret making humans because they were doing things He didn't want them to do, and God's list of things He doesn't want people to do is rather long and extensive and kind of ridiculous in my book. So when He says that you were doing things I didn't want you to do, and so I regret making human beings, I regret my decision to create, and now I'm going to wipe the slate clean by drowning every living creature. Even the innocent puppies and kittens and all the nursing babies, and it just doesn't make much sense to me.
Yeah, it doesn't make much sense to me either. That's right.
Especially under the loving God umbrella,
Yeah. So let's see. God saw that humanity had become thoroughly evil on the earth, that every idea in their minds that up was completely evil. And my assumption is that evil is that they're enslaving people and that murder is happening and all the rest.
He condones slavery, though, in the Bible. He's okay with it. Slavery, he has no problem with slavery. He even tells them in the New Testament to obey your masters, even the harsh ones. So, I don't see a problem with slavery as far as Yahweh is considered. He thinks it's great. He tells you to get your slaves from your neighbors. He says, hey, you can pass them down to your kids. I don't think, I just don't see it.
Yes. Well, listen, I agree with you. In fact, I think that's a fascinating thing about the book of Genesis. Because one of the things you see happen when people start building cities, that's when slavery starts happening. And I think that would be one of the things that in the Hebrew mind, and you should understand, just because when people tell stories about gods or God, I don't think that means that's true, that actually happened. I think that's telling us from people's understanding as the storytellers what they thought was going on. And
I can see that. They see a rubble or a destroyed city. Well, how did that happen? Well, I'll tell you how that happened, Bob says. And then you got a whole story,
So what becomes really interesting is in the book of Genesis, when you think about, I mentioned Cain killing Abel. So we have religious violence at the very beginning. Then God does violence. God says, I'm going to kill everybody who's violent. That doesn't work out so well. So
Right.
that doesn't work. So then God has a different strategy with Abraham, which is, instead of killing people, I'm going to bless everybody. I'm going to bless you, Abraham, so you'll become a blessing to everybody.
But only if you believe.
And then we get no, that actually doesn't say that. Christians
Well,
say
Deuteronomy is
that.
all
Religious
about,
people say
this
that.
is what happens. I'll send you blessings and whatnot if you do what I tell you, if you believe.
Oh,
blah, blah,
my
blah.
goodness.
And then,
you
what
are,
happens if
you are
don't.
so right. And then the book of Job comes along and says that everything in Deuteronomy is a bunch of crap. Right? So the Bible is full of these kinds of arguments about what we're supposed to do. And that's why I think doubt is so important. Because if a person just stops at one of these stories and says, you have to believe this, they end up believing horrible things about God and about human beings, about themselves. And that's why I think we need the freedom to question and doubt. And we need the freedom to look at things in a broader framework and bring the literary dimension in. Let me just add one thing about Genesis we were talking about. You get to the end of Genesis, and a group of brothers, just like we started with two brothers killing each other, at the end, a group of brothers are going to kill one brother. And at the last minute, they decide, well, let's not kill him. Let's sell him into slavery, which I think also, again, I don't think, it doesn't matter to me whether that story is true. I don't personally think I need to believe any of the things in Genesis happened as they're described. But what that seems so striking to me is, we start with people who kill all their enemies. Then we have people who enslave their enemies. But what happens at the end of the book is the guy who got sold into slavery turns around and has the chance to kill or enslave the brothers who were so terrible to him, and he decides to be nonviolent toward them. So that to me is this movement from violence to nonviolence. And when we are free from interpreting things in a literalistic way, I think we can start to see some of these larger patterns of meaning that I think are really there, but you can't see them when you're not allowed to question.
Well, I love questioning. Questioning is my favorite thing. Doubt it all. So if you don't think that these Old Testament, now correct me if I'm wrong, if you don't think that these Old Testament stories are describing Yahweh accurately, is that correct so far?
Well, I think they're stories about what people believed about God. And I think they would tell a story because maybe they liked one part of it. And they weren't theologians. They weren't doing what people today do with the
they
Bible.
Weren't scientists.
They weren't, these are collections of stories that were shared around a campfire. And in oral tradition, these stories carry important messages and reaffirmations about who we are and what kind of world we think we live in.
Well, some of the stories are just gross and terrible, like the Lot story and certain things like that. And then the comparison with the other one, the one in Judges with the
oh my gosh,
the harlot. That was an interesting, terrible story.
Oh my gosh, he butchers her and
she died at the doorstep after being that was horrible.
The cheapness of life is just staggering. Can I tell you something to me that's interesting about that, though? To me, one of the low points in the whole Bible is the book of Judges. You get to the end of the book of Judges, and then you turn the page and you come to the book of Ruth. Now, obviously, these weren't, these were separate texts that were brought together. But women are treated like dirt all through the book of Judges. And then you get to the book of Ruth, and a couple of women are the heroes. Exactly. And then you get to the book of Ruth, and women are the heroes of the story. And in fact, foreign women are the heroes of the story. So it's just so interesting that these tensions are there right in the biblical text. And when people are not forced to read the text in a sort of wooden, literalistic way, then they can see some of these other layers of meaning and interactions and arguments between the stories.
It's definitely an interesting way to look at it. But I want to know is since you take the Old Testament that way, how or where do you get your information about who or what or the character of Yahweh himself.
Yeah. Well, I think if you're asking me about that personally,
Absolutely.
I look at all of that and I see a developing story, and in that story, Jesus emerges. And so I take Jesus very seriously. And he seems to me to sort of side with all of the nonviolent messages and readings we've been talking about. And,
okay.
And,
I just don't see the nonviolent part, but go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, well, I'm happy to talk to you about that if you like. But
absolutely,
you asked me how I see that, and then I see the story continue right up to today, and people like Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr. and Desmond Tutu and Nelson Mandela and people today who I think embody that same message and continue to expand it and apply it in our world today. So I see these very same battles playing out in our day between people who want to use God to justify violence and people who think that's not right. So
I agree. Violence is not usually the answer, but Jesus was not this nonviolent guru that everyone seems to think he was. I mean, even the Bible explains it as, according to the Bible, Matthew 10:34, Jesus came to bring a sword. Do not suppose that I have come to bring peace to the earth. I did not come to bring peace, but a sword. And he talks about dividing families right afterwards.
Yeah. So do you think if the sword suggests division and the problem is families, then either Jesus is recommending that fathers should kill their sons and mothers should kill their daughter-in-laws and vice versa, or he's using that language metaphorically and he's saying, listen, I'm not going to fix all the problems. In fact, my message is going to create real problems in families. And something I notice in that passage, which I'm sad to say a lot of people use to just make Jesus sound like, yeah, Jesus is happy to kill people. Which
that's not the only spot, but yeah.
But just in that one, what's interesting is it's the older generation versus the younger generation, each of the examples he gives. And so I think he's saying, listen, like any person with a message who comes along, the older generation is not going to be ready for it, and they're going to be ready to cut off and reject the younger generation. And so I think he's telling the truth. I don't think he's speaking literally there. I don't think he's saying I advocate using a sword so that people will kill each other.
I don't think he's meaning that as well. This verse is saying that. I think what it's saying is that he's come to bring division. Don't think I come to bring peace. I'm here to divide families.
Yes.
My idea of what my worldview is going to divide from their worldview. So I'm going to be separating families. I don't think that's a good thing. Why don't we just kumbaya? And then he curses the fig tree. He throws the money changers out. In Mark 7, he scolds the Pharisees for not stoning disobedient children to death. He says to follow the law, and we all know how horrible the law is. All the crazy things in there. And then Mark 16, he says to pick up snakes and drink deadly poison. And these will be signs of people that, are his followers. And I think that's a terrible idea, Jesus. But, and then that's not even getting into the whole part what happens after Jesus comes back to earth. When Jesus comes back to earth, you think he's going to be all kumbaya and loving everybody? No, 2 Thessalonians tells us that he's going to punish the non-believers and there's going to be blazing fire. And then he says in, I don't remember where it was right now. Matthew 13, him and his army of angels are going to come back and throw disbelievers into hell. Now, regardless of what hell is, it doesn't sound like a fun place. It's not a timeout. We can get into that, but I see the love your neighbor parts and how Jesus tells us to help the poor and whatnot. Great. That's awesome. I don't need Jesus to tell me that though. These are just common sense things. If we're going to help the needy, hey, guess what? That's a good thing. If we all help each other, it's a good thing. I don't need Jesus to tell me that. I don't need him to, throw that in among the, I'm going to throw you into hell afterwards, or I'm going to bring division, or stone disobedient children. Why aren't you following the law? And then he changes, what was it, a divorce into adultery. There's so many different things that he did that wasn't so great, or is going to.
Can I just say?
Yeah, absolutely.
Can I just say, you are interpreting the Bible exactly like a fundamentalist, but you're rejecting it. I agree with you in rejecting the fundamentalist approach. But
so where do you get the character of this God then, if not from the verses? You just like certain verses, you get the character of it, and leave out the other verses, or just redefine these verses as something else. Let's just pick one. Let's pick the one where Jesus' army, Matthew 13, is going to come back.
Before we do that, though, let me just say, you just said you don't need Jesus or the Bible to tell you what's good. That we should love our neighbors and so on.
I don't.
So if I don't need that either, I just say, yeah, of course. I think I should love people, and I think that's more in line with kind of the ultimate reality, whatever it is we mean by God. And so that helps me to interpret the biblical text. I don't think you can have it both ways there. But I think I understand where you're coming from, Michael, and I agree with you. When people interpret the Bible in that literalistic way, it leads to some horrible, horrible things. And that's a big reason why I wrote this book. I want to give people permission to not be stuck in those boxes. The Matthew 13, can you remind me the passage? You're talking about when he told that series of parables about the seed and the yeast and the field and that series of parables, right?
I don't recall what happened before, but I do know the Matthew 13, 41 through 42, the Son of Man, he's talking about what's going to happen after, or when he comes back. The Son of Man will send out his angels, and they will weed out of his kingdom everything that has causes sin and all who do evil. They will throw them into the fiery furnace, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Now, I take this as he's going to come back and throw everybody who causes sin and all who do evil. He's going to throw them into a fiery furnace where there'll be weeping and gnashing of teeth. That's how I take it. Yeah. I'm very curious how you take this one.
Yeah. So whenever I don't blame you for taking it that way, because that's exactly the way a lot of preachers do it, right? They read a couple verses and then they make a sermon about it and they say this is what it means, and it almost always is about fear, scaring people and putting them under exactly the kind of duress that we talked about before. Mm-hmm. So I don't blame you for doing that. I think, and one of our huge problems is we have these 2,000 years of Christian theology and religious history and traditions of interpretation that interpret things that way, and then we go back and read them and assume that that's what was actually going on in the original setting.
Right. Well, so it's the parable of the weeds explained is what it is.
Yes. So what's happening in that larger context, I think, is that Jesus is saying, I'm here to start. To me, when he talks about kingdom of God, I don't think he's talking about something after this life. I think he's talking about a world where we love each other and treat each other the way we should, right?
That's
not rocket science, very much what you're talking about.
Yeah, there's common sense, let's all love each other and help each other do the best we can without doing any harm.
Yeah, but
it's just common sense.
But I wish it were common sense, man. But you and I both know there's a lot of people.
That's true. Well, people take extremity, for sure.
don't hold that in common. But but I think so. Jesus gives a series of stories trying to say what he means, and I don't think any of those stories should be taken literally. I think those stories are all parables, and parables are sort of like science fiction or some sort of the works of short fiction whose goal is to shock your imagination and grab your attention and make you think. And so I think, let me give you an example. I could say today, listen, if we continue to burn fossil fuels and we continue to take more from the earth than the earth can give and pump out more pollutants and toxins in the earth than the earth can absorb, that the time is going to come where the oceans are going to rise and droughts are going to come. And I'm not making a prophecy like God's going to do this. I'm just saying, look, if this is how we act, this is where it's going to go. And I think what Jesus is saying to his people is, if we keep going the way we are, thinking that violence is going to solve our problems, we will be violent to each other, and we will have a violent rebellion against Rome. And when we have a violent rebellion against Rome, they're going to come in and crush us, and there'll be nothing left. And interestingly, a few decades later, that's just what happened.
Let me read the verse real quick. It starts on 36. Then he left the crowd and went into the house. His disciples came to him and said, "Explain to us the parable of the weeds in the field." 37. He answered, "The one who sowed the good seed is the Son of Man." And we can both agree the Son of Man is Jesus, right? That's who he's referring to, himself?
Yeah.
Okay, so,
I mean, that's another interesting term. I think there's a lot going on with that term. But keep going. Keep going.
And the field is the world, and the good seed stands for the people of the kingdom. So the people of the kingdom, we can both agree, is Yahweh's people, correct? His believers, his followers.
Yeah, okay.
All right, so the world, you got the world, these people that don't believe, and then you got the good seeds, which is the people that do believe. And then the weeds are the people of the evil one, and the enemy who sows them is the devil. So I, according to this verse, am a person of the devil. Because I don't believe, I sin, I do things that Yahweh doesn't like. So I am a weed in Yahweh's eyes. In Jesus' eyes, I'm a weed, I need to be pulled. The harvest is the end of the age, and the harvesters are the angels. It's pretty self-explanatory. I mean, we got the world, Jesus is going to come back with his angels, and they're going to harvest and get rid of all the evil, bad people. The Son of Man, 41. The Son of Man will send out his angels, and they will weed out of his kingdom everything that causes sin and all who do evil. 42. They will throw them, they, meaning Jesus and these angels, will throw them into the blazing furnace where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Then the righteous will shine like the sun in the kingdom of their Father. Whoever has ears, let them hear. So, I mean, I'm not real sure how any other way we can take this as I'm a weed and I need to be plucked because I'm not perfect enough for Yahweh's field,
Yeah.
I don't see how we can take that any other way.
Yeah, well, if all you want to do is say you don't take it that way, I will stand right with you and say I don't take it that way either. Or if you're saying you don't believe that, I'll be glad to say I don't believe that either. I think other things are going on in that series of parables, and I think it's understandable that you or anyone else would take it that way because there are centuries. I bet we could flip through the stations on a radio and find some religious broadcasting station where they're preaching exactly that right now. So I don't blame you for taking it that way. But
how do you get anything other than that, though? I mean, how do you find the hidden meaning? Because it's very explanatory on what it's saying. I mean, the field is the world. The good seed stands for the people. Yeah, the weeds are the people that are the evil one, from the evil one. That's me.
Well, Michael, look, I'm a guest on your show. I don't want to argue with you and tell you I think you're wrong about anything. I'm your guest here, but you made a whole lot of assumptions. You said, for example, that people are certain that you're one of these weeds because you're imperfect, because you're not perfect, or because you don't believe. It doesn't say anything about believing in that text, which is really interesting because a whole lot of Christians say
it says causes
people who
sin.
are going to go to hell.
Causes sin. And I know that one of the sins is non-belief. So therefore I insert that as to one of the sins. So the kingdom of everywhere causes sin. That's me. And all who do evil. And it's evil not to believe. It's evil actually to spread atheism and non-belief. It's evil to even suggest worshiping another deity or not worshiping.
Oh my goodness, it's just so funny to hear you. I mean, you perfectly accept the rules of the game set up by the fundamentalists, and I agree with you. They're bad rules of the game.
Yeah. I mean, that's how it's written.
Let me make a different case.
Yeah,
for
of course.
your existence. Religious people are saying and doing some horrible things, terrible, terrible things. They're trashing people. They're saying that they just do horrible things, right? And I would say at that moment, thank God for atheists like you who will, or if you don't want to say God, I'm glad for, thank you for being someone who is willing to challenge them and show the irrationality and unacceptability of those beliefs. To me, I could say if you're teaching religious people to not live in fear and to not justify violence and to not justify hate and to, I would say, from my perspective, you're doing God's work, whether you believe in God or not. And you're calling that evil, but I actually don't think that's so evil.
Okay, well, let's get down to it then. We're almost out of time here. I just want to get down to the nitty-gritty of it. Why do you believe in Yahweh and Jesus? Why do you believe these characters exist?
Well, first of all, I have a feeling that when you say the word Yahweh, that you're importing a whole lot of meaning into that I probably don't.
Well, I mean, that's the name he gives himself, so I'm just going to go with it. There's a lot of gods, and they all have different names, you know?
Yeah, and anybody who knows much about the scriptures, especially Hebrew scriptures, knows that there are competing visions of what God is like. And in fact, you're probably familiar with what's called the documentary hypothesis, which is that there's one stream of biblical literature that calls God Yahweh, and another stream that calls God Elohim, and another stream that is really obsessed with sacrifice and priestly, matters. So I think in the text itself, there are these kinds of arguments. And I think this is where the Christian religion has done a real disservice to Christians and to the world by creating these sort of one-dimensional, literalistic readings of these very sophisticated and rich texts, right? But if you're asking me why I believe, so I don't want to say that I believe in that version of God as you're defining God, or in that
I don't think you do.
Jesus as you're defining Jesus.
Yeah, I mean,
but if you're saying why I believe there's something there, I suppose what I could say is this.
No, not why there's something there. Is why Yahweh and Jesus specifically. Sorry. Because I can get it. We can get into the whole why there might be something, but I want to know these guys specifically. Yeah.
Well, I mean, a very simple answer is I was brought up in the United States and not in India. If I were brought up in India, I'd probably be having a talk about Vishnu and Krishna and Vashti and so on. So, I mean, in one sense, it's that. If you're saying, and because I grew up fundamentalist, and I obviously am, doubted and left fundamentalism, but why I still even want to talk about God and Jesus? Well, partly because I took the freedom to not have to accept everything I was being told, and to some degree, because when you used the word common sense before, there was something just manifestly obvious to me that the best people I ever met were people who lived by love and not by judgment and hostility and arrogance and greed and so on, and racism and all the rest. And those people were guided by love. And it seems sort of commonsensical to me that, man, I would much rather live in a world where people are guided by love and respect and desire to reconcile and so on. And so if I think that there is that's where we get to something there. If I think that those things are actually the way things should be, then and I think there's some force or guidance or evolutionary direction in the universe that takes us there. When I say God, I'm happy to start at that point. I don't want to start with a literalistic, fundamentalistic way of reading the Bible. Does that make sense?
Kind of, yeah.
I'm not asking if you agree with it. I'm just saying if you understand it.
No, I appreciate that. But I still don't understand why Yahweh specifically, why you believe this deity exists.
Well,
I mean, I understand you grew up in a Christian home and America and all of that, but why do you believe that these characters are real?
Well, I think they're characters in a bunch of stories, but I think, I don't believe that Zeus or Hermes are real, but I do believe when the Greeks told those stories, they were using them as the best way they could to describe other things that were that they had no other language to talk about.
Right. Okay.
So it feels so. I think they're talking about something that's worth talking about. But
okay. Zeus?
I think you're concretizing, like you're taking a concrete definition there that, again, you have every reason to take because of the way 1,001 preachers do it, right?
Okay. But I think you're avoiding the question, though. It sounds like you're just kind of going around here. But why do you specifically believe that Yahweh exists? Do you communicate with him? Do you see him? Have you seen him? Have you experienced him? What is your reason?
But it's not that I'm trying to avoid your question. It's that your question is based on an assumption that I'm not sure I share. And that assumption is that when you say the word Yahweh, and you import into it all of. Well,
let's not import anything. Let's just import as this God that is talked about in the Bible. You believe that God exists. Now, let's not go into the whole child killing and all the vengeful and all that. We're not going into that. I just want to know why you believe this particular God is a real being that's really up there, that he's there, he's whatever he's doing.
Yeah. Even that, I think you're bringing so many assumptions into the term that I'm not sure I can answer the question without either misrepresenting myself or misleading you. Like even for the example, do I believe that God is up there? Well, it depends on what do you mean by up there. See, even those assumptions about God, I think, are sort of primitive Bronze Age kind of thinking. Up where?
Right. I'm sorry I used the word up there. How about let's go this way. Why do you believe in the God that you believe in?
Well, that would be a combination of experience and common sense. And,
okay, what experiences?
So many. But I give several of those kinds of experiences in my book. But I think the thing that almost all of us could relate to is some sense of better and worse. In some sense that maybe the term I use for it is like a moral summons, a summons to grow, a summons to keep learning and asking questions and seeking and yeah.
Yeah. So again, how is that Yahweh? I have that. I don't attribute it to Yahweh. I have this want to grow and be a better person. I attribute it to mainly my humanism. I would like to do better as a person constantly. Yeah. I think there's always room for me to grow. I think I could always learn something new. But I don't attribute that to this specific deity. Why do you attribute that to your deity?
I have a feeling you're boxing me into a corner. I'm going to be very honest with you, Michael. Yeah. I feel talking to you a lot like I feel when I talk to the kind of conservative Christians I grew up with, that there's an answer they want me to give, and they aren't as much trying to understand where I'm coming from as they are trying to decide whether I pass or fail the test.
No, I'm just trying to get to the bottom of the belief, man. I'm just trying to figure out why you believe it. Because to me, none of this makes a whole lot of sense. And to you, you've seemed to have it figured out. You've got your belief. You believe this guy exists, and I don't really know why, and I want to know why.
Yeah. this guy, see, there's the problem. This guy exists. See, all of those assumptions that come into that term, I think are worth doubting. So if I were to ask you, do you believe that life has meaning? Do you believe that life has value? Do you believe that,
I believe that life has meaning and value that we give it.
Yes.
We give it meaning, we give it value. I don't think that there's an invisible person that does that.
Yeah.
Now,
let me ask you this. Could you imagine that part of us that gives life meaning and purpose might have something to do with what we call God? Now, you might say it has nothing more. There's nothing more to it than...
Where is he needed in all that? Why do I need him for that?
Well, I'll tell you a reason historically, because through most of human history, 0.001% of the people owned, 90% of the wealth. We're moving in that direction again. But the elites would control all the masses, and their lives had no meaning. They were just there to be functionaries for the super powerful, who called themselves, who in some ways, they sort of took to themselves godlike rights and privileges. And can you see that if you were a slave in Egypt, and Pharaoh was using you to make a pyramid, and that pyramid was there in large part to be a worthy mausoleum, so that when he died, he would be taken, to his version of heaven, and that your life meant nothing just to get my life there. And if that slave says, actually, I think the same rationale that gives your life meaning gives my life meaning, at that point, we're having a really interesting conversation about where meaning comes from. And it's not just obvious to everybody, right? A whole lot of people are saying, no, the only human lives that have meaning are the ones at the top of the pyramid, pardon the pun. But, so I think when we are talking about where meaning, even if we want to talk about it within ourselves, we are these biological units that have evolved on this planet through, the processes of evolution over billions of years. And here we are having a conversation about truth and meaning and all the rest. And maybe whatever we mean by God is actually part of that conversation. So if you say, do you believe in Yahweh? And by Yahweh, you're defining it as a masculine, Bronze Age, dictatorial, controlling God. I think I'm talking about something different.
Yeah. Well, we can leave God out of the entire equation. We don't need him in there.
If we wanted to just talk about Jesus,
okay. Why do you believe Jesus was? Do you believe Jesus was the Son of God?
Again,
a God. Do you believe Jesus was the son of a God?
It depends on what we mean by those terms. So, for example, a lot of people, when they say that we're son of God, they think, oh, this means that God sent a divine sperm into the womb of Mary to make Mary conceive and all that. Look, I don't think any of that. Not exactly, and only one of the four stories of the gospel says that, which already tells you that there were a variety of ways of talking about Jesus from the beginning.
There's a lot of contradictions. Absolutely. So again, why do you believe it?
At that point, I don't want to say believe it means take it literally or deny it. I want to say, why would anybody tell a story like that? What would a story like that mean?
There's a lot of different reasons, and we can never know for sure.
Fascinating. But in a sense, because it's a literary text, we're invited to do some conversation about it. And if one of the things we talk about is, well, because arrogant men were running the world, and maybe the message is that if anything's going to happen of worth in this world, it's going to have to bypass arrogant men and start working with poor women, and that the current generation of people in charge have totally blown it and don't understand what's going on at all. And then if someone were to come up in that circumstance and start preaching a message of forgiveness and love and reconciliation, and the term he used for himself the most was not Son of God, but Son of Man, which is a really interesting term with all kinds of rich literary meaning. But and again, I'm aware that we could question all kinds of things about the accuracy of the gospel texts. And again, I think they're pointing towards something. And I don't need to argue about whether this version.
So is the Lord of the
version
Rings.
Is the only.
I mean, it's all pointing
That's
towards.
right.
You got
That's
every kind of story. It points to typically a moral, or a lesson.
Yeah.
You know, that's just the way things are. I don't take them as real, though. I don't take them as literal, or that these people exist. Like, I don't think there's hobbits.
Yeah. Yes.
You know, I don't think there's magical people. The Bible describes magical people. Jesus is magical. I mean, he can do all kinds of things. But regardless, we're out of time. And I appreciate all your answers and your time coming on and the book. Appreciate that. But we're out of time. And thank you. Thanks.
Thanks for having me. Keep up the good work. Bye-bye.
Absolutely. Talk to you later, man. Bye. And that's all the podcast there is for you today. Thanks for listening. If you like what you heard and you want to help keep the recording light on, simply go to patreon.com/BSW the podcast and sign up to be a supporter of the show. Your episodic tithes of $1 or more will give you access to the Patreon feed, unaired conversations, early access to each episode, and much more. For the latest events, BSW swag, and a peek behind the scenes, head over to the show's ever-evolving webpage at theBibleSaysWhat.com. Thanks to the cosmic powers of the internet, it is now possible to buy me a beer or coffee online. Simply go to buymeacoffee.com/BSW the podcast and click the appropriate buttons. If you can't support the show monetarily, please like, share, and or leave a review. As always, you can find me at the Bible Says What Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, or Instagram pages. You can also reach me at bswthepodcast@gmail.com. And no matter which platform you use to listen to your podcasts, don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you won't miss out on the next episode. Until then, would you kindly pick up your Bibles and read them? Kids, you want to say something? No? Going once. Going twice. Oh, I thought I heard Vinny said yeah. Nobody wants to say anything at the end? All right. Thanks for listening.